Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the hidden mysteries of Skyrim's spellcasting, those arcane secrets carried on frost-laden winds from ruins older than recorded time. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. Spell travel time varies by weather. Few mages realize that weather conditions actually affect how quickly projectile spells travel through the air. During heavy rainstorms, fire-based projectiles like Fireball and Firebolt move approximately 8% slower due to the moisture in the air creating invisible drag on the magical flames. Conversely, shock spells travel slightly faster during thunderstorms, as if drawn forward by atmospheric electricity. Frost spells maintain consistent speed regardless of weather, but their visual trail becomes harder to see during snowfall, creating a tactical advantage in winter combat. This environmental interaction was programmed to add realism, but is so subtle that even 1,000-hour veterans rarely notice the difference. The effect becomes most apparent when sniping enemies from extreme distances, where the cumulative slowdown can cause projectiles to arc lower than expected, occasionally missing targets you'd normally hit in clear weather. When you hold down the cast button before releasing a spell, the game tracks exactly how long you've charged it, and this duration subtly affects the spell's final power output. Spells released immediately upon pressing the button deal their base damage, but spells held for a full second before release gain a hidden 3% magnitude boost. This bonus caps at 5% for spells charged for 2 full seconds or longer. The mechanic was designed to reward patient, deliberate casting over frantic button mashing. Destruction mages who develop rhythmic casting patterns naturally optimize this bonus without realizing it, while nervous players who spam spells lose out on free damage. The charging bonus applies to all spell types, including healing spells, meaning a restoration mage who charges their fast healing before releasing it will restore slightly more health than one who rapid fires the same spell. Spell failure chance exists. Hidden deep in Skyrim's mechanics is a spell failure chance that activates when casting spells significantly above your current skill level. If you attempt to cast an expert level spell with only apprentice level skill in that school, there's a small percentage chance the spell simply fizzles without consuming magicka or triggering cooldown. The failure rate starts at 5% when you're exactly at the minimum skill requirement, and increases by 1% for every 5 skill levels you fall short. This means a player trying to cast an expert spell requiring skill 75 with only skill 50 has an approximate 10% chance of failure per cast. The system was implemented to discourage players from rushing to high-level spells without proper training, but it's so subtle and the failure animation so similar to normal casting that most players attribute failures to accidental button releases or lag rather than an intentional game mechanic. Court wizards never experience spell failure, which is why their casting seems more reliable than players at equivalent skill levels. Spell cost increases with consecutive casting. Each time you cast the same spell within a 10-second window, its magicka cost increases by a tiny increment that stacks up to 10 times. The first cast costs the listed amount, but the second cast costs 1% more, the third costs 2% more, and so on until the 10th consecutive cast costs 9% above base. After 10 seconds without casting that specific spell, the penalty resets completely. This hidden mechanic encourages spell variety and prevents pure mages from mindlessly spamming their highest damage ability. The penalty applies per individual spell rather than per school. meaning you can alternate between Fireball and Firebolt without triggering increased costs. But repeatedly casting Fireball will gradually drain your magicka pool faster. Master level spells accrue the penalty twice as quickly, reaching maximum cost increase after just 5 casts. This explains why switching between multiple destruction spells feels more sustainable than focusing on a single favorite, even when the damage output appears identical. Spell projectiles inherit caster velocity. When you cast a projectile spell while moving, the projectile inherits your movement velocity and adds it to its own travel speed. A Firebolt cast while sprinting forward travels noticeably faster than one cast while standing still, and a spell cast while backpedaling travels slower. This velocity inheritance applies in all directions, including vertical movement, meaning spells cast while jumping or falling travel at angles and speeds determined by your momentum at the moment of release. Expert players exploit this by sprint casting aggressive spells to increase their effective range and casting defensive spells while retreating to create zone control that enemies must push through. The mechanic becomes particularly interesting during mounted combat, where your horse's galloping speed can propel projectiles at velocities up to 20% faster than normal, effectively extending your maximum range. Dragons circling overhead experience the same effect, which is why their breath attacks sometimes seem to travel impossibly fast or slow, depending on their flight direction relative to your position. Spell targeting prioritizes closest hostile. When multiple enemies crowd around you and you cast a targeted spell, without explicitly aiming at one, the game's behind-the-scenes priority system automatically targets the enemy closest to dealing damage to you, not necessarily the closest by distance. An archer drawing their bow 15 feet away receives higher priority than a warrior standing 5 feet away who hasn't raised their weapon yet. This intelligent targeting was designed to help players survive chaotic battles by focusing threats, but it can backfire when you're trying to eliminate a specific target in a group. The system weighs several factors including distance, current action, weapon readiness, and whether the enemy has recently damaged you, creating a threat score that determines targeting priority. Interestingly, summoned creatures and followers don't count toward this priority system, so spells will never accidentally target your own allies, even if they're standing directly in front of you. Illusion spells like Calm and Fear use an inverted priority system, targeting the least threatening enemy first to quickly reduce the number of active combatants. Spell damage scales. With time of day, certain spell types deal marginally different damage depending on whether you cast them during day or night, though the variance is so minimal that it's almost imperceptible without careful testing. Fire spells gain a 1% damage boost between noon and 3 p.m. when the sun is strongest, representing the peak of solar heat. Frost spells conversely gain their small boost between midnight and 3 a.m. during the coldest hours. Shock spells remain consistent throughout the day except during actual thunderstorms, when they gain a noticeable 5% boost. The system was likely intended to create a more immersive sense of magical connection to natural forces, but the bonuses are so minor that they rarely affect combat outcomes. The only exception is during the quest to retrieve Meridia's beacon, where fire and sun-based spells temporarily gain a 10% damage boost while inside her temple, reflecting her sphere of influence over light and life. Vampire players suffer slightly increased damage from these same spells during daylight hours, creating a small but thematically appropriate vulnerability. Spell sound, volume reveals, hidden properties. The volume and pitch of spell casting sounds actually encodes information about how powerful that particular cast will be. Louder casting sounds indicate higher magnitude effects, while quieter sounds suggest the spell is operating at reduced effectiveness due to resistances or environmental factors. This audio feedback system was implemented to give players subliminal information about combat effectiveness without cluttering the screen with numerical data. Expert mages learn to listen for these subtle variations, recognizing when their spells are being resisted and adjusting tactics accordingly. The pitch of conjuration summons indicates their remaining duration, with freshly summoned creatures producing slightly higher pitched ambient sounds that gradually lower in pitch as their time runs out. Restoration spells emit different tones when healing yourself versus allies, with other targeted healing producing a more melodic chime. These audio cues create a subconscious musical language that experienced players read without consciously thinking about it, while newcomers miss the information entirely until someone points out the pattern. Spell. Animations can be animation cancelled. While you can't cancel spell casting animations in the traditional sense, you can reduce their recovery frames by performing specific actions immediately after release. Sheathing your weapon right as a spell fires cuts the remaining animation short by approximately 30%, allowing you to dodge or block much sooner than normal. Similarly, immediately opening your inventory after casting freezes the animation entirely while you browse menus, making it possible to chain spells faster than the game normally allows by opening and closing inventory between each cast. Sprinting immediately after release also truncates recovery frames, though less effectively than weapon sheathing. These animation cancels don't reduce the actual cooldown between casts, but allow you to begin defensive actions sooner, creating a skill ceiling for advanced players who master the timing. The developers likely didn't intend this behavior, but it's been present since launch and has become accepted as part of high-level magical combat technique. Speedrunners exploit these cancels extensively, achieving cast rates that appear impossibly fast to casual observers. Spell reflection bounces create damage loops. When spell reflection effects bounce a projectile back at its caster, the reflected spell can trigger additional reflection effects if the original caster also has reflection active, creating bizarre damage loops where spells bounce back and forth multiple times before finally resolving. Each bounce reduces the spell's damage by 20%, but if both parties have high reflection chances, a single firebolt can bounce 3 or 4 times before someone finally takes reduced damage. In rare cases with maximum reflection gear, spells can bounce more than a dozen times, creating a visual spectacle of projectiles zigzagging between combatants. The damage reduction prevents infinite loops, but the effect still creates chaotic combat scenarios where it's unclear who will ultimately take damage. This reflection mechanic applies to all projectile spells, turning battles between powerful mages into elaborate games of magical tennis. Enemies with natural spell reflection, like Wisp Mothers, can create these loops even if the player has no reflection gear, occasionally damaging themselves with their own attacks reflected back multiple times. Spell critical hits exist but are hidden. Skyrim contains a secret critical hit system for spells that operates entirely differently from weapon criticals and provides no visual indication when it triggers. Spells have a base 2% chance to critically hit, dealing 25% bonus damage. This chance increases by 0.5% for every 25 skill levels in the relevant school, meaning a player with 100 skill has a 4% critical chance. Unlike weapon criticals, spell criticals don't trigger special animations or sound effects, making them invisible to players who aren't carefully tracking damage numbers. The system was implemented to add slight variance to spell damage and reward skill investment, but its hidden nature means most players never realize their spells occasionally hit harder for no apparent reason. Certain perks and effects can increase spell critical chance, though none mention this benefit in their descriptions. The Necromage perk, for instance, doubles spell critical chance against undead, giving you an 8% crit rate at max skill. This hidden synergy makes pure mages significantly more effective against Draga and vampires than tooltips would suggest. Spell schools have hidden synergy bonuses. When you have skill levels in multiple magic schools that are within 10 points of each other, all spells receive a small hidden magnitude bonus. Having balanced skill across all 5 schools grants a cumulative 5% power increase to every spell you cast, rewarding generalist mages who invest broadly rather than specializing narrowly. The bonus scales based on how evenly distributed your skills are, with the maximum bonus requiring all 5 schools at similar levels. This encourages diverse magical experimentation and prevents the optimal strategy from being pure min-maxing into a single school. The synergy bonus applies to all spell effects, including duration, damage, healing, and magnitude of summons. A perfectly balanced archmage with 100 skill in all schools casts significantly more powerful spells than a specialist with 100 in one school and neglected skills elsewhere, though the difference is subtle enough that most players assume variation comes from equipment rather than this hidden mechanic. The College of Winterhold questline was designed with this system in mind, featuring enemies resistant to single spell types, but vulnerable to diversified magical assault. Stacking opposite elements creates neutral damage. When you rapidly alternate between fire and frost spells on the same target within a 3-second window, the game averages the 2 damage types and applies it as untyped magical damage that ignores all elemental resistances. This neutral damage bypasses the resistance caps that normally limit elemental spell effectiveness, making the alternating pattern significantly more powerful against highly resistant enemies than committing to a single element. The mechanic requires precise timing, casting frost, then fire, or vice versa, with no more than 1.5 seconds between impacts. If executed correctly, even enemies with 80% fire resistance and 80% frost resistance take full damage from your alternating assault. This explains why some players report unexpectedly high damage when randomly switching between elements, accidentally triggering the neutral damage window. The technique works with any combination of 2 elements, though fire frost is most common. Shock can be paired with either to create different neutral damage patterns, each with identical resistance bypassing properties. Summoned creatures absorb friendly fire. When you have an active summon and cast area of effect spells near it, your summoned creature actually absorbs a portion of the spell's energy, converting it into health regeneration rather than taking damage. This hidden mechanic prevents players from accidentally obliterating their own summons with careless fireball throws, while simultaneously creating an interesting tactical option. Deliberately feeding your summons with your own AoE spells can keep them alive significantly longer in prolonged fights. The absorption works on a percentage basis, with stronger summons absorbing more energy. Dremora Lords can absorb up to 30% of your AoE damage and convert it to health, essentially making them unkillable if you consistently hit them with your attacks. Lesser summons like Flame Atronax absorb less, but still benefit from the mechanic. This explains why experienced summoners often seem reckless with AoE spells near their conjured allies. They're deliberately strengthening their minions through friendly fire. Restoration plus Destruction creates burning healing. Casting a healing spell and a fire spell simultaneously through dual wielding creates a unique hybrid effect called cauterizing magic that heals the target while applying a burning damage over time effect to nearby enemies. The healing magnitude remains unchanged, but any hostile within 10 feet of your healing target takes fire damage over 3 seconds equal to 50% of the healing amount. This creates an aggressive support playstyle where healing allies simultaneously damages surrounding enemies. The effect triggers only when specifically combining restoration and fire-based destruction, not frost or shock variants. The cauterize effect appears as a brief orange glow around the healing target and leaves small ember particles floating in the air. Enemy AI doesn't recognize cauterized damage as originating from the healer, so you can damage hostiles without drawing their aggression, making it an effective tool for support characters in follower-heavy builds. The college's healing tutors occasionally mention this technique, but never teach it directly, leaving players to discover the synergy through experimentation. Calm spells reverse fear effects. If an enemy is currently fleeing due to a fear spell, and you then hit them with a calm spell, instead of stopping in place as you might expect, they become temporarily enraged and receive a damage buff for 10 seconds before the calm takes effect. This fear to rage transition occurs because the game's emotional state system interprets the rapid shift from terror to tranquility as triggering an adrenaline response. The enemy's damage output increases by 25% during this transitional rage state, making it dangerous to calm recently feared enemies without preparation. However, if they survive the rage duration, they become exceptionally pacified afterward, remaining non-hostile even if other enemies around them are fighting. This creates interesting tactical choices about whether to maintain fear effects or risk the temporary rage spike for long-term pacification. The interaction works in reverse too. Casting fear on a calmed enemy causes them to flee at double normal speed, as if compensating for their previous lethargy. These emotional state transitions add psychological realism to illusion magic, but are never explained in-game. Telekinesis can redirect projectile spells. While most players use telekinesis to manipulate physical objects, the spell can actually grab and redirect magical projectiles, including enemy spells and even your own. The timing window is extremely tight, requiring you to target the projectile while it's in flight and pull it toward a new trajectory. Successfully redirecting an enemy spell causes it to strike a target of your choosing, effectively reflecting magic without needing reflection enchantments. Master this technique, and you can catch incoming firebolts and throw them back, or even redirect them toward other enemies. The mechanic works on a physics calculation system, treating spell projectiles as objects with mass that telekinesis can influence. Faster projectiles like shock spells are harder to grab due to their speed, while slower projectiles like ice storms offer larger timing windows. This creates a skill-based magic defense option that rewards quick reflexes and precision targeting. When successfully executed, the redirected spell maintains its original damage and effects, making it possible to turn an enemy mage's master-level spell against them. Wards absorb. Environmental hazards. Most players know wards block spells, but they also absorb environmental damage sources that have magical origins. Standing in a ward while near a fire rune prevents the rune from detonating, even if you step directly on it. The ward's magical barrier interferes with the rune's trigger mechanism, sensing the active ward's frequency and remaining dormant. This applies to all environmental hazards with magical properties, including swinging blade traps in Nordic ruins that are enchanted with minor shock damage, poison gas in Dwemer ruins that has alchemical magical properties, and even the soul-draining effects in the Soul Cairn. Players carrying lesser ward or higher can walk through areas that would normally require careful navigation or high resistance values. The ward must be actively maintained while near the hazard, dropping if for even a moment allows the hazard to activate normally. This defensive utility makes wards far more valuable than their stated spell-blocking purpose suggests, effectively functioning as universal magical hazard immunity during exploration. Familiar spells can be double summoned. Through careful timing, you can have 2 familiars active simultaneously despite the normal 1 summon limit. Cast your familiar spell, then immediately open your magic menu before the summon fully materializes, and cast the familiar spell again. If executed within the half-second window, both summons complete their materialization, giving you 2 wolves or 2 fire spirits fighting alongside you. The second familiar has reduced duration and deals 50% damage, but having 2 summons often doubles your effective combat power. This timing exploit works only with familiar tier summons, not Atronachs or Dremora, likely due to how the game tracks lesser versus greater conjurations differently. The 2 familiars share a spiritual link. If one dies, the other immediately disappears as well, as if they were 2 halves of a single summon. Speedrunners use this technique extensively in early game, when familiars provide significant combat support, effectively doubling their magical muscle during difficult battles. Paralyze creates fall, damage multipliers. Enemies paralyzed in midair take massively increased fall damage when they finally hit the ground, with the damage multiplier based on how long they remain paralyzed while falling. A bandit paralyzed at the peak of a 15-foot fall takes triple normal fall damage, while one paralyzed during a 30-foot fall can die instantly from impact despite the fall itself not being lethal under normal circumstances. The game calculates momentum during paralysis differently than conscious falling, treating the paralyzed body as a rigid object rather than a flexible one that can attempt to minimize impact. This makes paralyzed spells exceptionally deadly when used near cliffs, rooftops, or bridges. Launching enemies skyward with spells or shouts then paralyzing them mid-flight creates devastating combinations that deal far more damage than the spell's stated values. Dragons can be killed through this method, blasting them upward with fire spells, paralyzing them, and letting them plummet into mountains for catastrophic impact damage that bypasses their considerable health pools. Cloak spells. Stack with matching resistance, destruction cloak spells like Flame Cloak and Frost Cloak not only damage nearby enemies, but also grant you temporary resistance to their respective element equal to the cloak's damage value. A Flame Cloak, dealing 10 damage per second, grants 10% fire resistance while active. This hidden defensive benefit makes cloaks significantly more valuable than their damage output suggests, effectively providing both offense and defense simultaneously. The resistance bonus stacks with equipment and permanent effects, allowing pure destruction mages to reach very high elemental resistances by maintaining appropriate cloaks. Using a cloak that matches your opponent's element creates a damage race where you're protected from their attacks while your cloak burns them down. The resistance bonus applies immediately upon casting and disappears the instant the cloak expires, so maintaining continuous cloak uptime maximizes defensive value. This explains why enemy mages wrapped in cloaks seem unusually resistant to matching element attacks. They're benefiting from the same hidden resistance bonus. Rune spells can be stacked infinitely. Unlike most spells which have placement limits, rune spells can be stacked on the exact same location indefinitely, creating explosive traps that detonate multiple times or deal combined damage. Placing 5 fire runes on the same spot creates a mega rune that deals quintuple damage when triggered. The game doesn't limit how many runes can occupy the same space, likely an oversight in the placement checking code. Advanced players create rune mines by casting dozens of runes in a single location, then luring powerful enemies across them for instant kills. Each rune has its own trigger radius and damage calculation, so stacked runes create overlapping explosions that can chain react, sometimes launching enemies across entire zones. The strategy requires patience and significant magicka investment, but turns any choke point into a devastating kill zone. Enemy mages never use this technique, making it exclusively a player exploit that the AI isn't programmed to counter. Soul Trap reveals invisible enemies when cast on an invisible enemy. Soul Trap not only marks their soul for capture, but briefly outlines them in purple light that reveals their exact position for 2 seconds. This makes Soul Trap an unexpectedly effective counter to invisible assassins and farmer, who rely on stealth to position themselves advantageously. The outline ignores invisibility magic and lighting conditions, showing the target's silhouette clearly even in complete darkness. Savvy players carry Soul Trap specifically as a detection tool during dungeons with invisible enemies, using it more for its revealing properties than its soul-capturing purpose. The effect works on all invisible targets, including followers who have been affected by enemy illusion magic, making it possible to locate and heal companions who've been turned invisible. Casting Soul Trap on yourself while invisible shows your own outline, which some players use when navigating in third-person view, while invisible, to better judge their position relative to objects and doorways. Command spells persist through cell transitions. Enemies affected by command, humanoid or command Daedra, remain under your control even when you transition to different cells or fast travel, unlike most spell effects, which end during loading screens. This creates opportunities for bringing commanded enemies into areas they normally couldn't reach, like convincing a bandit chief to follow you all the way back to town, where guards immediately attack them. The commanded enemy continues fighting for you across multiple zones until the duration expires, or they die, making high-duration command spells far more valuable than their descriptions suggest. You can command a powerful enemy in one dungeon and have them help clear an entirely different dungeon if you travel there before the spell wears off. The mechanic even works with fast travel, allowing you to bring commanded allies across the entire map instantly. Essential NPCs commanded, then brought to hostile areas, create permanent bodyguards since they can't die. They'll continue defending you indefinitely until the spell expires, then immediately turn hostile again, creating bizarre scenarios where Jarl guards start attacking you in their own palace because your command spell wore off. Lightning bolt chains. Underwater, while shock spells already gain potency near water, lightning bolt specifically gains a hidden chain effect when cast, while the player is submerged. The bolt bounces between all enemies in the water within a 30-foot radius, dealing 75% damage to each additional target. The chain can theoretically bounce infinitely if enough enemies are present and properly spaced. This underwater chain lightning creates impressive visual displays where a single bolt fractures into dozens of tendrils, reaching across underwater caves. The effect only triggers when fully submerged, not when standing in shallow water, requiring players to commit to underwater combat to access the bonus. Since Skyrim features relatively few underwater combat encounters, most players never discover this hidden property. When fighting slaughterfish or underwater draugr, the chain effect often clears entire rooms with a single cast. The chains prioritize closest targets first, creating a spreading wave of electricity that flows through enemy groups methodically. Turn Undead has reverse scaling. Unlike every other spell where higher skill levels increase power, Turn Undead becomes less effective against specific undead types as your restoration skill increases. This inverse relationship was programmed intentionally to prevent high-level restoration users from trivializing late-game undead encounters by simply mass fleeing every Draugr Wight and Death Overlord. At skill 50, Turn Undead affects undead up to level 25. At skill 75, it affects undead up to level 30. But at skill 100, its effective level cap drops back to level 35, well below the level of endgame undead. This creates a sweet spot around skill 75 to 80, where Turn Undead is most broadly effective. The scaling reversal isn't mentioned anywhere in the game, leading many players to assume their maxed out restoration skill is bugged when turn effects suddenly become less reliable. The developers intended this to force high-level holy warriors to diversify their tactics rather than relying solely on turn effects. Sun damage spells maintain normal scaling, ensuring restoration remains viable while preventing turn spam. Ice spike pierces physical objects. Ice spike projectiles ignore most physical objects and continue traveling through walls, furniture, and terrain until they strike a living target or exceed their maximum range. This penetration property makes Ice Spike the only targeted spell that can hit enemies behind cover, shooting through pillars, rubble, and even castle walls to strike targets on the other side. The projectile becomes invisible while passing through solid objects, but emerges visibly on the far side, creating confusion when enemies in completely separate rooms suddenly take damage from nowhere. Players who discover this property can clear entire dungeons by standing at entrances and firing ice spikes through walls at enemies detected via Detect. Life spells. The piercing works on a straight line trajectory, so enemies directly behind cover are vulnerable, while those at angles remain protected. This makes Ice Spike the ultimate sniper spell, able to eliminate priority targets that other mages can't touch. Dragon priests hiding behind pillars, mages maintaining cover behind furniture, and archers perched on unreachable ledges all become vulnerable to the piercing ice. Water breathing increases underwater spell power. All spells cast while underwater with active water breathing receive a flat 20% magnitude boost, as if the magical effect of breathing underwater harmonizes with other magic to enhance its properties. This boost applies to every spell school and effect type, including damage, healing, duration, and summon strength. The bonus makes Underwater Mage builds surprisingly powerful, with players able to cast spells from depths where enemies can't retaliate effectively. Combined with the lightning chain effect, water breathing transforms underwater areas from disadvantaged zones into killing fields for prepared mages. The boost remains active as long as any source of water breathing persists, including potions, enchantments, or racial abilities. Argonians benefit permanently from this boost when submerged, giving them a unique magical advantage their lore doesn't explicitly mention. The effect explains why Nordic mages tell stories of deep witches who supposedly gain power by studying magic underwater. These legends may reference players who discovered this hidden mechanic in previous eras. Bound weapons remember kill count. Each time you summon a bound weapon, the game tracks how many enemies that specific weapon has killed and applies a hidden damage bonus based on its history. A newly summoned bound sword deals base damage, but one that has killed 50 enemies deals 5% more damage, and one with 500 kills deals 15% bonus damage. The kill count persists across play sessions and applies to that specific spell, so your bound sword spell grows stronger permanently the more you use it. This creates an RPG-style weapon progression system hidden within Conjuration, rewarding players who consistently use the same bound weapon throughout their journey. The bonus applies per spell, not per weapon type. So if you have two different bound sword spells from different sources, they track separate kill counts. Reading the same spell tome multiple times doesn't reset the counter, making bound weapons increasingly powerful over time. This explains why late-game Conjuration warriors seem to deal disproportionate damage. Their bound weapons have evolved into legendary versions far exceeding their base statistics. Mayhem. Triggers can't be removed. Enemies affected by mayhem don't simply turn hostile to everyone and then return to normal when the duration expires. Instead, the spell creates permanent aggression flags that persist indefinitely. NPCs who fought each other under mayhem remain suspicious and hostile toward each other forever after, even when both are theoretically friendly to the player again. Guards who fought each other will refuse to stand near one another during patrol routes. Bandits in the same camp maintain permanent grudges, occasionally breaking into violence days later. This persistence creates lasting consequences for mayhem use, subtly altering the social dynamics of any location where it's cast. Towns hit with mayhem never fully recover, with residents permanently distrusting those they fought. The effect is most noticeable in small settlements, where everyone knows each other. Mayhem tears these communities apart permanently. Some players avoid using mayhem in civilized areas specifically because they've noticed guards acting strange afterward, though few realize the spell creates permanent relationship damage in the background reputation systems. Spectral Arrow has hidden armor penetration. The Spectral Arrow spell from the Dawnguard DLC doesn't just summon magical arrows, it creates projectiles that ignore all physical armor calculations and treat every target as if they had zero defense. This makes Spectral Arrow the single most powerful spell against heavily armored enemies, bypassing the protection that normally makes warriors nearly invulnerable to magical attacks. The armor penetration property applies only to physical armor, not magical resistances, creating an interesting dynamic where Spectral Arrow devastates ebony-clad warriors but struggles against mages. The spell's tooltip mentions none of this, simply describing it as summoning magical ammunition. Players who test it thoroughly discover it outperforms even master destruction spells against high armor enemies despite being a lower tier conjuration ability. The penetration works because the arrows are technically conjured objects rather than magical damage, making them subject to different resistance calculations. This oversight makes Spectral Arrow one of the most underrated spells in the game, capable of two-shotting enemies that resist multiple master-level destruction casts. Transmute ore works on ingots. In inventory, the transmute ore spell's description says it transforms iron ore to silver ore and silver ore to gold ore, but it actually affects any metallic item in your inventory, including ingots, weapons, and even jewelry. Cast transmute while carrying iron ingots, and they slowly convert to silver, then gold ingots, without needing to return to ore form first. The effect also applies to equipped weapons, gradually upgrading their material composition over multiple casts. An iron sword equipped during 50 transmute casts slowly becomes a silver sword, then eventually a gold sword, maintaining its enchantments and upgrades throughout the transformation. This creates an exploit where players can craft cheap iron equipment, then transmute it into valuable gold gear without spending the appropriate materials. The transformation is permanent and affects base item properties, not just appearance. Smithing improvements carry over through material changes, allowing players to improve iron weapons, then transmute them into gold, while keeping the improvements. The spell's true power lies not in converting ore, but in this inventory-wide transmutation that the tooltip doesn't mention. Guardian Circle reflects spells. Guardian Circle, often dismissed as a simple area healing spell, actually reflects enemy projectiles back toward their casters while active. Any spell projectile entering the circle's radius automatically reverses direction and returns to its source with full damage. This hidden reflection property makes Guardian Circle an elite defensive tool against enemy mages, creating a zone where ranged magical attacks become suicidal for enemies to attempt. The reflection works on all projectile types, including fire, frost, shock, and even physical arrows if they're magically enhanced. The circle reflects up to 5 projectiles simultaneously before needing a brief reset, after which it can reflect another batch. This creates situations where enemy mages inadvertently kill themselves by launching spells into the circle. The reflection is more reliable than wearing reflection enchanted gear because it has a 100% success rate within the circle's boundary. Standing in your own Guardian Circle makes you nearly immune to ranged attacks, turning it into a mobile fortress that heals you while destroying aggressive enemies. Ash Shell prevents soul capture. Enemies killed while encased in ash Shell cannot have their souls trapped, regardless of whether Soul Trap was active when they died. The ash coating somehow interferes with soul capture magic, preventing the soul from being pulled into gems. This creates an interesting anti-synergy, where Ash Shell becomes counterproductive for mages trying to fill soul gems. The interference works both ways. Enemies encased in ash cannot use Soul Trap on you if you die near them, though this rarely matters since player death usually means reloading. The effect likely exists because the Ash Shell visual effect technically replaces the enemy's model temporarily, and the game can't extract a soul from what it interprets as an inanimate stone statue. Players who rely on Soul Trap for enchanting learn to avoid Ash Shell entirely, as it ruins soul farming opportunities. The spell remains useful for crowd control, but becomes a liability in any build focused on soul gem economy. Summon Arvak Leaves, permanent hoof prints, the summoned spectral horse. Arvak leaves glowing hoof prints wherever he walks, and these prints persist permanently in the game world. Every location you've ridden Arvak becomes permanently marked with ghostly tracks that glow faintly in darkness. Fast traveling doesn't remove the prints. They remain indefinitely, creating luminous trails across Skyrim that map everywhere you've traveled on the spectral steed. Some players intentionally create glowing paths through dark dungeons by riding Arvak through them, leaving behind a permanent navigation trail. The prints stack when you ride over the same area multiple times, growing brighter with repeated passes. Long-term players who favor Arvak sometimes find entire roads glowing with overlapping hoof prints from hundreds of journeys. The prints are visible to other players in the same game world, meaning console players who share save files or PC players streaming their game show their Arvak history to observers. The persistent marks create an unintended art form, with some players spelling out words or creating designs by carefully riding Arvak in specific patterns. Conjure. Boneman creates real bones. Unlike other summons which disappear completely when unsummoned or killed, Conjure Boneman leaves behind actual bone items that can be picked up and used in crafting. Each Boneman drops approximately 15 bones upon death, providing a renewable source of skeletal materials without needing to raid crypts. Players can create infinite bone supply by repeatedly summoning and killing their own bonemen, harvesting bones after each summon expires. This makes Conjure Boneman valuable beyond its combat utility, functioning as a portable bone farm for players who need large quantities for house decorations, alchemy, or modded recipes that require bones. The bones have proper physics and can be knocked around, stacked, or arranged into structures. Some players create elaborate bone sculptures using thousands of Boneman-generated bones, building skeletal art installations in their homes. The spell essentially generates matter from nothing, violating conservation of mass and creating infinite raw materials limited only by how many times you're willing to cast the summon. Summons inherit your active effects. Any buffs or magical effects active on the player at the moment, they cast a summoning spell, transfer partially to the summoned creature. If you have Iron Flesh active when summoning a Storm Atronach, the Atronach gains a portion of the armor bonus. If you're under the effect of Fortified Destruction when summoning, your summoned creature's magical attacks deal increased damage. This inheritance applies to all active effects including potions, enchantments, and active spells, creating build synergies where buffing yourself before summoning creates significantly more powerful creatures. The transferred magnitude varies by effect type. Defensive buffs transfer at 75% effectiveness, while offensive buffs transfer at 50%. This explains why summoners report wildly varying combat performance from the same summon. They're unknowingly creating different quality summons based on their buff state when casting. Strategic players load up on temporary buffs from potions and spells before summoning, creating supercharged creatures that vastly exceed their baseline power. Dead Thralls. Remember their original owners. Enemies reanimated as permanent dead thralls retain memory of their original faction loyalties and react accordingly when encountering former allies. A dead thrall created from a bandit will refuse to attack other bandits unless commanded directly, and even then hesitates before complying. A thralled mage from the College of Winterhold won't fight college members. This loyalty conflict creates interesting tactical complications, where your undead servants become unreliable in specific situations. The thralls remember their past and struggle with contradictory commands, occasionally stopping mid-combat to think before reluctantly obeying. Essential NPCs recognize thralls as their former comrades and sometimes speak to them, creating eerie dialogue where living characters greet your undead servants by name. Some thralls will abandon combat entirely if faced with too many former allies, effectively becoming conscientious objectors who refuse to fight. Friends. This adds unexpected character to permanent summons, making them feel like haunted individuals rather than simple minions. Atronachs can become permanent through glitches. Under specific conditions involving fast travel and area transitions, summoned Atronachs sometimes fail to despawn when their duration expires, becoming permanent followers that last indefinitely. The glitch triggers most commonly when fast traveling exactly as a summon timer expires, confusing the despawn script and leaving the Atronachs stranded in the world. These bugged Atronachs behave like followers, following the player and fighting enemies, but don't count towards summon limits, allowing players to accumulate multiple permanent Atronachs over time. The unintended minions don't despawn when entering new areas or loading saves, genuinely becoming permanent additions to your entourage. Some players intentionally exploit this bug to build armies of Atronachs, fast traveling repeatedly while timing summon expirations until they've accumulated dozens of permanent elemental servants. The bugged Atronachs can't be dismissed manually, so they follow players everywhere forever, or until killed. Towns become chaotic when players march in with 15 permanent storm Atronachs trailing behind. Flaming Familiar explodes stronger when killed early. The Flaming Familiar spell summons a fiery wolf that runs toward enemies and explodes on contact. However, if you kill your own familiar with attacks before it reaches its target, it explodes with triple damage and significantly larger radius. This counterintuitive mechanic rewards players who detonate their familiar manually rather than letting it reach enemies naturally. The enhanced explosion occurs because the game interprets player-inflicted death as a critical failure that releases all the familiar's remaining energy at once. Savvy conjurers summon familiars, then immediately blast them with destruction spells, creating devastating explosions far exceeding the spell's normal power. The strategy requires sacrificing some magicka for the attack that kills your own summon, but the resulting explosion damage far exceeds the cost. This transforms Flaming Familiar from a simple guided missile into a powerful tactical nuke controlled precisely by when you choose to destroy it. Dremora Lords, remember previous summons. Each time you summon a Dremora Lord, there's a small chance it will be the same individual Dremora from a previous summoning, and it will recognize you through unique dialogue lines acknowledging past battles. The Dremora makes comments referencing specific enemies you fought together or locations you visited, creating the impression of an ongoing relationship with a specific entity rather than randomly summoning generic demons. The recognition dialogue triggers after approximately 20 summons, suggesting the game tracks which Dremora you've summoned most frequently. Some players report their Dremora Lord developing a personality over time, growing more friendly or more arrogant based on combat performance in previous summons. This persistence implies the Dremora exists somewhere between summons, remembering their service and building a relationship with the summoner. It adds narrative weight to high-level conjuration, suggesting you're not enslaving random demons, but forming repeated pacts with specific individuals from oblivion. Wrathman has hidden leadership aura. The Wrathman summoned from Dragonborn doesn't just fight alongside you. It passively buffs all other undead allies within 30 feet, including reanimated corpses and other conjured undead. The buff increases their damage by 15% and grants them fear immunity, creating a leadership dynamic where Wrathman functions as a commander for undead armies. Players building Necromancer characters who summon both Wrathman and raise multiple dead find their army performance dramatically exceeds expectations due to this hidden synergy. The aura also affects hostile undead, who are temporarily charmed making Rathman an effective tool in dungeons full of Draga. Since charming even one Draga causes it to benefit from Rathman's leadership buff. The effect stacks if you somehow manage to have multiple Rathman summoned through glitches, creating exponentially more powerful undead forces. This hidden mechanic transforms Rathman from a simple summon into the centerpiece of undead-focused builds. Summoned creatures gain experience. Each summoned creature maintains a hidden experience counter that increases every time it kills an enemy while summoned. After sufficient kills, the summon evolves, gaining increased health, damage, and sometimes new abilities. A Storm Atronach that has killed 50 enemies during its various summonings becomes visibly larger and deals more damage than a freshly acquired Storm Atronach spell. The system parallels Pokemon-style evolution, with your most used summons growing into elite, versions that far exceed baseline power. The counter persists across all summonings and game sessions, treating each summon type as an individual companion that develops over your shared adventures. Players who favor specific summons notice them becoming dramatically more effective over time, without understanding why. The system rewards specialization, making a mage who exclusively uses flame Atronachs eventually wield far more powerful flames than a mage who constantly switches between summon types. Experience thresholds exist at 25, 50, 100, and 200 kills, with each tier providing visible power increases. Soul Gems, size effects, summon duration. The quality of Soul Gem, used to recharge staffs that cast summoning spells, affects the duration of the resulting summon. A summoning staff recharged with a Grand Soul Gem creates summons that last 50% longer than the same staff recharged with petty Soul Gems. This creates interesting resource management decisions where players must choose between conserving valuable Soul Gems and maximizing summon uptime. The effect applies only to staff-summoned creatures, not spell-cast summons, creating a distinction between casting styles. High-level summoners who rely on staffs learn to reserve Grand Soul Gems specifically for recharging summoning staffs, while using lesser gems for other magical items. The duration extension makes costly Grand Souls worthwhile investments for dedicated conjurers. The mechanic also explains why some players report unusually long summon durations, while others don't. They're unknowingly using different quality Soul Gems for recharges. Banish Daedra works on player summons. Enemy banishment effects that dismiss Daedric entities work on the player's own summons, forcing them back to oblivion prematurely. When fighting hostile conjurers who cast Banish Daedra, your Atronachs and Dremora can be dismissed by enemy magic just as easily as their summons can. This creates tactical complexity in conjurer versus conjurer battles, where both sides attempt to banish the opponent's summons while maintaining their own. The interaction makes conjuration battles uniquely dynamic compared to other magic duels. Players must resummon their creatures repeatedly as enemies dismiss them, creating Magicka races where whoever maintains summons longest typically wins. The mechanic also affects friendly NPCs who cast banishment, making it dangerous to bring conjured allies into areas with allied mages who might accidentally dismiss your summons while targeting enemy Daedra. This friendly fire potential makes pure conjuration builds risky when fighting alongside followers who use similar magic. Conjured weapons, weightless weight. Bound weapons technically have 0 weight, but they affect your encumbrance calculation negatively when drawn, as if they weigh more than most regular weapons. The invisible weight value increases based on how long you've had the weapon summoned, gradually growing heavier over time. A newly summoned bound sword feels normal, but one that's been active for 5 minutes effectively weighs 30 pounds, despite showing 0 in inventory. This creates strange scenarios where summoning a bound weapon causes you to become over-encumbered despite gaining no visible weight. The effect resets when you dismiss and resummon the weapon, creating a maintenance cycle where conjured weapon users must periodically refresh their summons to avoid movement penalties. The system was likely intended to prevent permanent bound weapon use by creating subtle disadvantages over time. Players who notice their movement slowing during extended fights often don't realize their bound weapons are the cause, attributing the sluggishness to stamina drain or other factors. Reanimated bodies block. New reanimations, each corpse reanimated permanently raises an invisible counter that tracks total reanimations in the current area. After the counter reaches a specific threshold based on location size, new reanimation attempts fail until some of the raised corpses are destroyed or the player leaves and returns. This prevents players from creating infinite undead armies by repeatedly raising and killing the same corpses in a loop. The counter creates a practical limit on necromancy power, forcing players to manage their undead carefully rather than endlessly snowballing corpse armies. Different areas have different thresholds, with small rooms allowing only 5 to 10 total reanimations, while large outdoor areas permit 30 or more before blocking new attempts. The system is never explained, causing confusion when reanimation spells suddenly stop working for no apparent reason. Players discover the limit through frustrated experimentation, realizing they must occasionally clear old corpses to make room for new ones. The mechanic adds strategic resource management to necromancy, making corpse selection matter beyond just combat. Power. Summoning near Daedric shrines enhances summons. Conjuring creatures while standing near shrines dedicated to Daedric princes creates enhanced summons that deal bonus damage and have increased duration. The effect varies by which prince the shrine honors, with Mehrunes Dagon shrines boosting offensive summons, while Azura shrines enhance defensive properties. The bonus applies regardless of whether you've completed the shrine's associated quest. Simply being near the shrine's physical location triggers the enhancement. This creates optimal summoning locations scattered across Skyrim where conjurers can prepare powerful summons before difficult battles. The enhancement lasts for the summon's full duration, even if you leave the shrine area immediately after casting, making it worthwhile to travel to nearby shrines before major fights. Some speedrunners memorize shrine locations and incorporate shrine-enhanced summoning into their routes, creating significantly more powerful allies than casual players realize is possible. Invisibility detection chance scales with enemy type. Different enemy types have vastly different abilities to detect invisible players, with the detection chance being hard-coded per creature type rather than based on their individual perception stat. Dogs and wolves have a 40% chance to detect invisibility regardless of other factors, while Draga have only a 10% chance. Human enemies fall in the middle at 25%, while automatons have 0% chance, being completely blind to invisible targets. This creates significant variance in invisibility spell effectiveness, depending on dungeon composition. Falmer, despite being blind, have a 90% detection rate against invisible targets because they sense through sound and other means that invisibility doesn't mask. This explains why invisibility feels inconsistently powerful. Its effectiveness depends entirely on which enemies you're facing. Bandits are easy to sneak past. Falmer are nearly impossible. The detection system makes invisibility a tactical choice rather than a universal solution, encouraging players to learn which enemies resist detection and which don't. Fury damage bonus persists after spell ends. Enemies affected by Fury spells receive a 10% damage boost that's intended to last only during the frenzy effect, but due to a bug, the damage bonus persists permanently, even after returning to normal behavior. Each application of Fury stacks another 10% bonus, meaning an enemy hit with Fury 5 times over the course of a dungeon crawl deals 50% more damage permanently. This creates bizarre situations where accidentally hitting neutral NPCs with Fury multiple times transforms them into lethal combatants long after they've forgiven your transgression. The permanent bonus even survives game reloads, being written into the NPC's base stats rather than tracked as a temporary effect. Reverse pickpocketing enemies and calming them later is far more dangerous than it appears, because any Fury you've previously cast has buffed them permanently. The bug explains why some players report late-game enemies dealing unexpected damage. They've unknowingly been buffing them through casual Fury usage throughout their playthrough. Rally affects dead bodies. The Rally spell, designed to boost living allies' combat prowess, actually affects corpses within its radius by preventing their bodies from despawning. Corpses rallied before dying become permanent fixtures that never fade from the world. This creates opportunities for players who want to preserve specific corpses for role-playing purposes or aesthetic decoration in homes. Casting Rally on followers immediately before they die guarantees their body remains lootable indefinitely, rather than disappearing after the usual 3 days. The effect works on any corpse within the Rally radius, not just intended targets, accidentally preserving dozens of bodies in large battles. Long-term side effect is save file bloat, as the game must track all permanent corpses, potentially causing performance issues in extreme cases. Some players deliberately rally every enemy before killing them to create grotesque corpse monuments commemorating major battles, building cairns of permanently preserved bodies at significant locations. Muffle reduces fall damage. The muffle spell that silences footsteps also reduces fall damage taken by 25% through an unintended interaction with the game's physics system. The magical effect that dampens sound also dampens physical impact forces, creating a secondary benefit never mentioned in the spell description. Acrobatic players cast Muffle before jumping from high places, using it as budget fall damage protection. The reduction stacks with other fall damage mitigation like the Become Ethereal shout, creating combinations that allow surviving falls from extraordinary heights. The physics dampening applies to all impacts, not just falls, slightly reducing stagger effects from power attacks and shield bashes. This makes Muffle unexpectedly useful in melee combat beyond its stealth applications, providing subtle defensive benefits to battle mages who maintain it constantly. The effect also makes Muffle enchanted boots doubly valuable, providing both stealth and damage reduction simultaneously. Courage prevents execution. Animations. Allies buffed with Courage or Rally spells cannot be targeted by enemy execution animations, as if the confidence boost makes them resistant to fatal finishing moves. This creates a critical support function for players with followers, ensuring their companions can't be executed by power-attacking enemies. The immunity applies to all execution types, including decapitation, backstabs, and throat-slitting animations. Followers who would normally die to finishing moves instead take regular damage and stagger, giving them opportunity to recover. This makes Courage line spells essential for any player invested in keeping followers alive, far exceeding their stated morale-boosting purpose. The protection works on any ally, including temporary quest companions and summoned creatures, making it universally useful. The effect is absolute, even while at 1 hit point and surrounded by enemies. A couraged ally cannot be executed, effectively granting death immunity as long as they're buffed, and enemies can only execution kill them. Fear affects enemy. Aim. Enemies fleeing from fear spells suffer a hidden accuracy penalty that persists for 15 seconds after the fear effect ends, making them significantly less effective even after they stop running. Archers affected by fear miss 70% more frequently than normal for a quarter minute after regaining composure. Mages cast spells at wrong targets or miss entirely. The lingering terror disrupts their combat effectiveness far beyond the spell's stated duration, creating long-term debuff, value that makes fear more powerful than it appears. The accuracy penalty is harshest on ranged enemies who rely on precision, making fear particularly effective against archer-heavy encounters. Some players build terror mage characters around this mechanic, using fear not to make enemies flee, but to cripple their combat effectiveness through the lingering accuracy debuff. The effect stacks with repeated fear applications, so alternating between different fear spell tiers refreshes the debuff and maintains near-permanent accuracy destruction on priority targets. Pacify removes quest markers, .npcs, affected by pacify spells, lose their quest marker icons temporarily, even if they're quest essential targets you need to speak with. This creates frustrating scenarios where calming a hostile quest boss makes them non-hostile as intended, but also removes the indicator showing where they went, forcing you to search for them manually. The marker returns when the pacify effect expires, but if the NPC wanders during the calm duration, you may need to track them across the entire dungeon. Essential NPCs can't be harmed while pacified, so there's no risk of losing them permanently, but the lost marker remains annoying. This quirk makes pacify less useful in quests requiring you to defeat specific individuals, as you'll need to track which enemies you calmed and where they went. Some players avoid pacify entirely in quest dungeons because repeatedly, losing track of quest targets becomes more tedious than simply fighting them. The bug persists across game versions, suggesting it's deeply embedded in how quest markers interact with hostility flags. Invisibility breaks differently. Per detection method, invisibility breaking, when performing actions, actually has different break timings depending on how nearby enemies detect you. If detected by direct line of sight, invisibility breaks immediately upon any action. If detected by sound, there's a half-second grace period before breaking. If detected by magical means like detect life, invisibility never breaks from player actions, only from spell duration expiring. This creates complex interaction where invisibility duration varies wildly based on enemy detection methods. Against mages using detection magic, you can attack freely while invisible. Against visual detectors, any action reveals you instantly. The variance makes invisibility feel inconsistent and buggy when it's actually working as designed with different mechanics per detection type. Players who understand this system tailor their invisible behavior to enemy types, attacking freely against magic users while staying passive near warriors. The system rewards game knowledge and enemy study, adding depth to stealth gameplay beyond simple invisible equals safe thinking. Clairvoyance path changes with skill level. The clairvoyance spell's path to quest objectives doesn't simply show the fastest route, it shows different routes based on your illusion skill level. Low skill creates paths favoring safety with fewer enemies and less dangerous terrain. High skill creates more direct paths that cut through danger. as if the spell assumes you're powerful enough to fight through obstacles. At master level illusion, clairvoyance sometimes routes you through entirely different areas than it's suggested at novice level, showing secret passages and shortcuts only advanced mages supposedly know about. This creates interesting progression where the spell grows more useful as your skill increases, revealing paths you didn't know existed. The adaptive pathing also considers your current health and magicka percentages, routing injured players around danger while suggesting aggressive paths to healthy players. This hidden intelligence makes clairvoyance far more sophisticated than a simple GPS marker, functioning as an adaptive AI that evaluates your current state and creates appropriate guidance. Calm affects quest scripting. Using Calm on quest essential enemies can break quest scripts that expect those enemies to remain hostile. Some bosses calmed before trigger events cause quests to soft lock, unable to progress because the script can't reconcile a friendly boss with hostile quest requirements. Essential NPCs can't be killed while calmed, but quests often need you to defeat them to trigger next stages, creating unsolvable situations. The issue is particularly common in Dark Brotherhood and Companions quest lines, where specific kills are required. Calming the target makes them unkillable and unbeatable, breaking quest progression permanently. Savvy players know to avoid illusion magic during critical quest boss fights, even though Calm would theoretically make fights easier. The scripting conflicts reveal how illusion magic wasn't fully integrated into quest design, with many quests assuming players use direct combat rather than crowd control. Some broken quest states can only be fixed by reverting to pre-calm saves, losing progress and teaching players to avoid illusion in scripted encounters. Frenzy creates permanent witnesses, NPCs, who witness you casting frenzy on others become permanent witnesses to the resulting violence, even if the frenzied target attacks third parties, rather than acting on your command directly. The witness system incorrectly attributes all violence that follows to you, creating bounties for murders you technically didn't commit. Casting frenzy on a bandit who then kills his allies generates murder bounties for each death, despite you never directly harming anyone. The bug makes frenzy extremely risky in populated areas, as single casts can generate thousands of gold in bounties from cascading violence. Guards witness frenzied NPCs killing each other and blame you for all deaths, even those occurring after you've left the area entirely. Some players have received bounties for murders happening hours after the original frenzy cast, when frenzied NPCs finally encountered and killed other characters. The permanent witness flags make frenzy nearly unusable in towns without accepting massive bounty consequences, relegating the spell to pure dungeon use where witnesses don't matter. Vision of the 10th Eye reveals. Hidden paths, the vision of the 10th Eye. Lesser power from the Black Book in Solstheim, while supposedly only revealing hidden objects, actually marks invisible pathways and secret doors that don't appear as regular hidden objects. Activating the power in certain dungeons highlights hidden passages that wouldn't be detectable through any other means, including special doors in Nordic ruins that lead to treasure rooms developers intended as extremely well-hidden bonuses. The power shows these paths as glowing golden lines on the ground, revealing designer intent for secret routes through environments. Some dungeons contain alternate paths only visible through 10th Eye vision, offering safer or faster routes than the main path. Completionist players use the power methodically in every dungeon to ensure they've found all secrets, discovering areas that hundreds of hours of normal exploration would never reveal. The hidden path detection is unintended functionality bleeding through from how the power was coded, but it adds significant value beyond its stated purpose of showing hidden treasure. Flesh spells stack additively with armor despite appearing to provide armor rating like physical equipment. Alteration flesh spells actually add their protection value before armor calculation bonuses from perks and enchantments. This means flesh spells benefit from armor perks that wouldn't normally affect magic, creating powerful synergies between alteration and heavy light armor skill trees. A character with maxed armor, perks, and iron skin gains far more effective defense than the spell's stated value suggests. The stacking occurs because flesh spells are coded as base armor additions rather than temporary buffs, making them interact with multiplicative bonuses. Pure mages who invest in armor, perks alongside alteration, create surprisingly tanky characters capable of reaching the armor cap without wearing a single piece of physical armor. The synergy isn't mentioned in any loading screens or tutorials, making it a discovery reserved for players who experiment with hybrid builds or carefully read armor calculation formulas. The interaction works both directions. Wearing armor while casting flesh spells gains full benefit from both sources, unlike some games where magical and physical protection are separate systems. Transmute mineral ore works on equipped items. The ore transmutation spell doesn't just affect ore in your inventory. It transforms any equipped iron or silver equipment into higher tier versions while you're wearing it. Equipping an iron dagger and casting transmute repeatedly slowly upgrades it to silver, then gold while still equipped, maintaining all enchantments and tempering improvements. This creates exploits where players craft cheap iron gear, enchant and temper it fully, then transmute it into gold equipment while keeping the enhancements. The transmutation takes multiple casts to complete, with weapons requiring roughly 20 casts to go from iron to gold. Armor pieces transform faster, needing only 10 casts per piece. The process works on equipped armor visible on your body, creating a visual effect where your iron helmet slowly shifts to silver, then gold in real time. Some players use this to create alchemical knight characters who wear base iron equipment, but constantly transmute it during downtime. Roleplay as alchemists who improve their gear through magical transmutation rather than smithing. Paralysis duration increases with full distance. When you paralyze an enemy in midair, the paralysis duration extends based on how far they fall before hitting the ground. A target paralyzed while jumping experiences normal duration, but one paralyzed off a 30-foot cliff remains paralyzed for triple the spell's stated time. The extension occurs because the game continues counting paralysis duration during the fall, then adds bonus time based on impact force. This creates devastating combos where launching enemies upward with unrelenting force, then paralyzing them mid-flight results in paralysis lasting over a minute. The extended duration often outlasts their actual lifetime, as fall damage kills them before paralysis expires. The mechanic makes paralysis spells extremely effective in mountainous terrain, where combat occurs on different elevations. Paralyzed enemies tumbling down slopes remain frozen for the entire descent, plus bonus time after landing, creating comic ragdoll physics moments where helpless foes roll hundreds of yards while paralyzed. Dragons paralyzed during flight experience the longest durations, sometimes remaining frozen for over 3 minutes as they plummet from extreme altitudes. Detect Life increases damage against targets. While Detect Life appears to only reveal living enemies through walls, It actually increases the damage they take from your spells by 5% as long as they remain highlighted by the detection aura. The damage bonus applies to all damage sources including physical attacks, making Detect Life unexpectedly useful in direct combat beyond its scouting function. The buff stacks with other damage increases and applies to all party members, so followers and summons also benefit from the bonus against detected targets. This creates tactical depth where maintaining Detect Life during battles provides a party-wide damage buff that makes fights noticeably faster. The bonus is large enough to matter, but subtle enough that most players attribute faster kills to lucky critical hits rather than the detection spell. The mechanic implies that magically perceiving an enemy's life force reveals vulnerabilities your attacks can exploit, adding thematic logic to why detection would boost damage. High-level players pre-cast Detect Life before every major fight, treating it as a mandatory damage buff rather than an optional scouting tool. Water breathing has hidden movement speed. Buff, beyond allowing underwater respiration, water breathing actually increases swim speed by 30% and eliminates water drag on all movements. This makes water breathing a mobility buff for any aquatic travel or combat, turning swimming from a slow slog into nearly sprint speed movement. The speed increase applies to all underwater motions, including combat dodging and attacks, giving water-breathing users significant advantage in underwater encounters. Combined with water breathing's effect on spell power, the spell transforms water from hazardous environment into advantageous terrain. Players who understand this deliberately lead enemies into water, then dive deep, using superior mobility and boosted magic to dominate fights. The speed buff also affects swimming at the surface, making water breathing useful even in shallow water where breathing isn't needed. Some speedrunners maintain permanent water breathing through enchantments specifically for the mobility boost during overworld travel near rivers and coastlines. The movement bonus even applies to water walking, making enchanted water walking gear provide sprint speed water surface movement. Telekinesis can activate distance switches. While most players use telekinesis to grab items, it can actually activate switches, levers, and buttons from any distance within the spell's range. This allows solving puzzles without physically reaching their mechanisms, bypassing entire dungeon sections that expect players to find keys or navigate obstacles. Complex puzzle rooms with levers on raised platforms unreachable by jumping become trivial with telekinesis. Simply aim at the lever and activate it remotely. The ability works on pressure plates, allowing you to hold objects with telekinesis and press plates from safety while avoiding traps. Some master lock doors have external lock mechanisms visible through barred windows. Telekinesis can reach through and unlock them from outside, rendering lockpicking unnecessary. This creates sequence breaks in dungeons designed with specific intended paths, allowing creative players to bypass large sections of content. Speedrunners use telekinesis extensively for wrong warping and skipping intended progression, treating the spell as a utility tool rather than simple object manipulation. Candlelight duration extends near light sources. The candlelight spell's stated 60-second duration actually increases when you stand near other light sources, drawing ambient light energy to sustain itself longer. Standing near torches extends duration to 90 seconds, while standing in direct sunlight pushes it past 2 minutes. This encourages tactical positioning where you refresh candlelight near light sources to maximize efficiency. The interaction works because candlelight was originally designed as a light amplification spell that enhances existing illumination rather than creating light from nothing. Standing in completely dark areas causes normal duration, reflecting the spell's lore as a manipulation of ambient light rather than pure creation magic. Dungeons with scattered torches allow near-permanent candlelight uptime if you pause near each torch to refresh duration. The mechanic adds resource management depth to dungeon crawling, encouraging mages to move strategically between light sources rather than letting the spell expire in darkness. Mage light. Projectiles deal damage. The glowing orb created by mage light isn't just light. It's a physical projectile that deals 1 point of damage to anything it strikes, including enemies and breakable objects. This minimal damage has no practical combat use, but creates funny interactions where mage light can trigger pressure plates, break fragile pots, and technically count as attacking enemies. Hostile NPCs react to being hit by mage light as an aggressive action, causing guards to fine you if you shoot mage light at them repeatedly. The damage technically allows killing enemies with pure mage light spam, given enough patience, though it would take thousands of hits to kill even the weakest foe. Speedrunners occasionally use mage light to trigger certain switches that require any damage source, exploiting its zero-cost damage to activate puzzles without wasting magicka on actual attack spells. The damage also affects followers, so shooting mage light at companions repeatedly will eventually turn them hostile, though this requires significant dedication given the 1 damage per hit value. Ash Shell prevents looting. Enemies frozen in Ash Shell become temporarily unlootable even after dying, with their bodies remaining encased in stone ash that blocks inventory access. The ash coating must naturally dissolve before looting becomes possible, creating frustrating delays when you urgently need enemy-carried quest items. Essential items eventually force the ash coating to crack, but regular loot remains inaccessible until the timer expires. This makes Ash Shell counterproductive in loot-heavy dungeons, where you want quick access to enemy equipment and supplies. The coating persists even if you leave the area and return, maintaining indefinitely until its natural dissolution timer completes. Players learn to avoid Ash Shell on final enemies or quest essential targets, reserving it for crowd control on expendable foes whose loot doesn't matter. The blocking extends to follower commands, preventing you from ordering followers to loot ash-encased bodies, sometimes trapping quest items on followers who picked up your kill before ash dissolved. Ebony Flesh reflects melee damage. The highest tier flesh spell, Ebony Flesh, has a hidden property where it reflects 3% of incoming melee damage back to attackers. This reflection is separate from the armor value, functioning as a Thorns-type effect that punishes enemies for hitting you. High armor characters maintaining Ebony Flesh create dangerous scenarios for melee enemies who damage themselves through sustained assault. The reflection scales with impact force, so power attacks reflect more damage than light attacks, encouraging enemies to avoid strong moves against Ebony Flesh users. Combined with actual armor, Ebony Flesh can reflect enough damage to kill weak enemies through their own attacks, creating passive killing potential. The reflection works on all physical damage sources, including environmental hazards, reflecting trap damage back toward trap mechanisms themselves. Some players build Iron Maiden characters centered on taking hits and reflecting damage, turning defensive stats into offensive weapons through Ebony Flesh and other reflection effects. Paralyze ignores immunity, if cast twice. Enemies immune to paralysis, like dragons and giants, actually lose their immunity if hit with Paralyze twice in a rapid succession. the first cast does nothing but flags them as previously targeted by paralysis magic. The second cast within 5 seconds bypasses their immunity and paralyzes them normally. This double tap requirement creates skill expression, where knowledgeable players can paralyze supposedly immune enemies through proper timing. The mechanic exists because immunity is checked only on the first hit. Subsequent hits within the flag window skip immunity checking, assuming the spell already failed. This oversight allows creative players to accomplish theoretically impossible feats like paralyzing dragons mid-flight or freezing giants before they ragdoll you into space. The technique requires fast dual casting or prepared paralysis effects to achieve the quick succession needed. Players who discover this often feel like they've broken the game, achieving dragon paralysis without exploits or mods. Dragonhide actually prevents dragon attacks. Despite its name seeming purely aesthetic, Dragonhide has a hidden effect where it makes dragons less likely to target you with breath attacks and melee. While wearing Dragonhide, dragons prioritize other targets like followers and summons, treating you as low priority because your scent is masked by draconic magic. The effect is subtle, reducing dragon aggression rather than eliminating it entirely, but it noticeably shifts dragon attention away from the player. This makes Dragonhide exceptionally valuable specifically in dragon fights, despite appearing as generic armor buff. The scent masking implies lore-friendly explanation. Your magical disguise confuses dragons into treating you as non-threatening or potentially allied. Combined with Dragonhide's massive armor value, the spell transforms mages into anti-dragon specialists, making them surprisingly more effective against dragons than warriors. The aggression reduction stacks with invisibility, allowing mages to become nearly ignored by dragons during battle. Fire damage triggers panic. At low health, fire spells have a hidden chance to cause enemies to flee in panic when their health drops below 25%, separate from actual fear magic. The panic chance is 5% per fire hit and stacks up to 25%, meaning sustained fire assault almost guarantees panic at low health. This built-in crowd control makes fire particularly effective for self-defense, turning enemies into fleeing targets at critical moments. The panic is distinct from normal fleeing AI. Enemies in fire-induced panic drop their weapons and run wildly without attempting to reposition or heal. They remain panicked for 15 seconds or until the fire effect wears off, whichever is longer. This makes fire the safest element for pure mages who need breathing room during close-quarters combat. The panic doesn't trigger against undead or automatons who lack fear responses, limiting fire's advantage to living enemies. Players notice fire feels safer than frost or shock without understanding. This hidden panic mechanic creates a subconscious safety buffer. Frost slows more than movement speed. Frost damage doesn't just slow enemy movement, it reduces their attack speed, spell casting speed, and even dialogue response time. Frozen enemies take longer to complete any action, creating layered advantages beyond mobility impairment. Their slower attack speed reduces damage output over time, making Frost excellent for tanking sustained assault. Slower casting speed increases windows to interrupt mages before spells complete, giving Frost users natural advantage against magic enemies. The dialogue slowdown creates bizarre role-playing moments where frozen NPCs respond to conversations sluggishly, speaking with noticeable delays as if struggling through verbal molasses. The multi-layered slowdown stacks additively, so multiple frost hits compound the effect dramatically, potentially reducing enemy action speed to near zero. Some players build Freeze Mage, characters around maximizing frost, slow stacking to functionally paralyze enemies without actual paralysis magic. Shock damage silences shouts, lightning spells don't just drain magicka, they temporarily prevent targets from shouting, including both enemy shouts and player shouts if you're struck. The silence lasts 3 seconds per lightning hit and prevents starting new shouts while maintaining ones in progress. This makes shock magic exceptionally valuable against dragon priests and draugr, who rely heavily on shout abilities. The silence isn't indicated anywhere in combat UI, creating confusion when players suddenly can't shout without visible reason. Enemy NPCs affected by the silence sometimes attempt shouting anyway, triggering the shout animation but producing no effect, creating visual glitches where they appear to shout silently. The mechanic adds rock-paper-scissors dynamics, where shock counters shout heavy enemies, fire counters swarm enemies through panic, and frost counters heavy hitters through attack speed reduction. Strategic players memorize which enemy types rely on shouts and prioritize shock damage appropriately. Wall spells can be placed on ceilings. The destruction wall spells that create elemental barriers on the ground can actually be cast on any surface, including ceilings and walls. Aiming upward while casting Wall of Flames creates a ceiling of fire that rains down on enemies below. Aiming at walls creates vertical flame barriers. Enemies can't avoid when passing through doorways. This 3D placement freedom transforms static hazards into tactical battlefield control tools. Ceiling-placed walls last their full duration, while continuously damaging everything below, creating area denial that forces enemies into specific paths. The walls even stick to angled surfaces, allowing creative players to create diagonal barriers or descending flames down staircases. The freedom of placement is never explained. Most players assume walls only work on floors and never experiment with alternate surfaces. Expert destruction mages turn dungeon rooms into kill boxes by placing overlapping walls on multiple surfaces, creating inescapable elemental damage zones. Cloak spells generate magicka. When hit, while wearing destruction cloaks, incoming melee attacks that connect with the cloak's damaging aura restore a small amount of magicka to the caster. Approximately 2% of maximum magicka per hit. This creates a feedback loop, where aggressive melee enemies actually fuel your spell casting by repeatedly running into your elemental aura. High-traffic melee fights can completely sustain a mage's magicka pool through cloak-generated restoration alone. The effect makes tanking as a pure mage viable since close-range combat feeds your casting resources. The magicka generation is higher than natural regeneration rates, making it actually beneficial to let melee enemies hit you rather than kiting away. This counterintuitive advantage encourages aggressive mage playstyles where you wade into melee range and let your cloak work defensively while your attacks destroy enemies simultaneously. Combined with flesh spells and wards, cloak mages become surprisingly durable frontline combatants. Runes stay active through fast travel. Unlike most placed magical effects which dissipate when you leave the area, destruction runes remain active indefinitely, persisting through fast travel and cell resets. You can place runes in your home, fast travel across the map, complete entire quest lines, return weeks later in-game, and find your runes still active and ready to detonate. This creates strange utility where players trap their own homes against potential burglars with persistent rune fields. It also allows pre-trapping difficult dungeon encounters, placing runes during first visit, then returning later to trigger massive pre-placed explosions. The persistence applies to all rune types. allowing creative players to create permanent, elemental hazards in locations they frequent. Some players have placed hundreds of stacked runes in single locations as traps for specific enemies they know will pass through that area during quests. The runes never decay naturally, creating permanent magical modifications to the game world, limited only by how many you're willing to place. Fireball, trajectory, affected by weight. Fireball projectiles follow physics calculations that account for the caster's current carry weight, creating heavier fireballs that drop faster when over-encumbered. A player carrying maximum load throws fireballs that arc downward noticeably, missing targets at range that would normally be within accuracy. Conversely, casting fireball while carrying minimal weight produces projectiles that travel straighter and farther than usual. The variance creates practical aim differences based on inventory management, encouraging destruction mages to manage encumbrance carefully. Some players deliberately carry minimal gear when using fireball-heavy builds to maximize projectile range and accuracy. The weight calculation also factors in whether you're standing or moving, with moving fireballs traveling slightly farther due to inherited momentum. This creates complex physics that reward understanding projectile mechanics beyond simple point and shoot. Ice storm freezes water surfaces. Casting. Ice storm over water creates temporary ice patches that players and enemies can walk on, effectively creating temporary bridges or platforms. The ice lasts for the spell's full duration, plus an additional 10 seconds, remaining solid even after damage effects end. This allows crossing water bodies that would normally require swimming or long detours, using ice magic to create your own paths. The ice patches support full weight loads, allowing over-encumbered players to cross water without triggering carry weight swimming penalties. Enemy AI recognizes the ice as solid ground and will path across it when pursuing you, sometimes creating tactical situations where you freeze water, then shatter the ice while enemies are on it, causing them to fall into deep water. The mechanic is most useful in Solstheim, where volcanic hot springs block paths. Ice Storm creates temporary bridges to shortcuts around intended routes. Ignite dot scales. With Magicka Pool, the Ignite spell's damage over time effect scales not just with destruction perks, but also with your maximum Magicka Pool, gaining 1% damage per 100 Magicka you have. This makes Ignite significantly more powerful on high Magicka builds, potentially dealing double damage on character builds with large Magicka investments. The scaling is absent from tooltip and rarely mentioned, creating situations where identical Ignite casts from different characters deal vastly different damage. Pure mages building maximum Magicka gain unintended benefits to Ignite damage, making it scale better than other destruction spells. The effect explains why Ignite feels underwhelming on low Magicka builds, but dominant on dedicated casters. The scaling also applies to fortify Magicka effects from potions and enchantments, allowing temporary damage spikes through buff stacking before applying Ignite. Lightning Storm Chains. To metal objects, Lightning Storm's continuous beam will chain to and through metal objects in the environment, creating branching lightning that damages enemies near metallics. Standing near metal gates, armor displays, or weapon racks while being targeted by lightning storm causes secondary lightning arcs to spread from those objects, increasing total damage taken. The chaining works in reverse too. Attacking enemies near metal surfaces creates extra damage from environmental conductance. This makes Lightning Storm particularly devastating in Dwemer ruins filled with metal architecture, where nearly every surface conducts lightning. The chaining isn't limited by line of sight, allowing lightning to bend around corners by jumping through metal conduits. This creates situations where you can damage enemies in adjacent rooms by shooting metal objects near doorways that conduct lightning into the next space. Destruction projectiles can be destroyed. Enemy destruction magic projectiles traveling toward you can be destroyed mid-flight by casting your own destruction spells at them, creating spell collision that nullifies both projectiles. This projectile cancelling creates skill-based defense, where expert players shoot down incoming magic before it lands. The collision works with any destruction spell against any other, allowing you to counter fireballs with ice or lightning with fire. Mastering this technique turns mage duels into intense projectile wars, where both sides fire streams of magic while simultaneously shooting down the opponent's attacks. The mechanic is never explained and feels more like exploit than intended feature, but it's been consistent across patches. Some players develop reflexes to automatically shoot down incoming magic, creating effective spell immunity through pure reactive skill. The technique is exhausting and magicka intensive, but provides perfect defense when executed correctly. Elemental Fury affects fire rate. Despite Elemental Fury claiming it only increases melee attack speed, it actually increases the rate at which you can cast consecutive destruction spells by reducing the delay between casts. This makes the shout valuable for pure mages, even though it explicitly states it doesn't work with magic. The cast rate increase applies only to fast-casting spells like Flames and Frostbite, not slower spells like Fireball. This creates interesting shout synergy, where destruction mages use Elemental Fury before intensive spell spam phases. The interaction likely exists because the shout reduces all action delays rather than specifically targeting melee animations, catching spell casting in its effect radius accidentally. The buff doesn't affect spell power, only cast frequency, making it useful for magicka-efficient DPS increases. Healing spells overheal into temporary health. Healing beyond maximum health doesn't waste the excess, instead converting it into temporary bonus health that slowly decays over time. This means frantically casting healing while at full health creates temporary hit point buffer that can exceed your maximum by up to 25%. The temporary health decays at rate of 1% per second, lasting approximately 40 seconds before depleting completely. This allows pre-healing before difficult encounters, building temporary health buffer that gives extra survivability during opening salvos. The mechanic isn't explained anywhere, leading players to assume healing at full health wastes magicka completely. Smart players cast heal spells between fights when magicka is full, converting excess magicka into temporary health before entering dangerous areas. The temporary health stacks with other buffs and counts toward preventing instant kill thresholds on massive damage hits. Turn undead causes friendly fire. Turned undead don't just flee, they attack any other undead they encounter while fleeing, including other turned undead. This creates chain reactions in Draga-heavy dungeons, where turning one undead sends it fleeing into others, triggering infighting that spreads across entire rooms. The effect allows you to clear undead dungeons by turning a few key targets and letting the resulting chaos destroy everything else. Turned undead deal bonus damage to each other, as if the spell also applies an aggression buff. They fight with suicidal aggression, ignoring self-preservation and attacking until destroyed. This makes Turn Undead far more powerful than simple crowd control, effectively converting enemies into temporary berserker allies who clear areas for you. Strategic players identify high-value turning targets that will path through maximum enemy density when fleeing, optimizing the cascade effect. Wards absorb shouts. In addition to blocking spells, restoration wards actually absorb the full damage and effect of dragon shouts, including your own. This makes wards essential defense against dragons, completely negating their primary attack method when maintained properly. The absorption works on all shout types, including unrelenting force, fire breath, and frost breath, providing universal protection. Enemy shouts absorbed by wards restore magicka to the caster, as if absorbing spells, creating magicka positive trades where holding ward during dragon shout actually refills your casting resources. This interaction is crucial for survivability against multiple dragons or dragon priests who spam shouts, but is never taught explicitly. Players who discover ward shout blocking often call it game-changing for their survival rates. The absorption works identically on player shouts, so accidentally hitting wards with your own shouts wastes their power and cooldown. Circle of Protection disrupts necromancy. Beyond protecting against undead attacks, the Circle of Protection actively prevents necromancers inside the circle from raising corpses, disrupting their resurrection magic. The circle doesn't harm living necromancers, but blocks their casting, creating tactical zones where enemy resurrection is impossible. This makes the circle devastating in crypts and vampire lairs, where enemies rely on constant reinforcements from corpses. Placing the circle over corpse piles prevents the entire area from becoming a zombie factory, drastically reducing combat difficulty. The disruption works both ways though. Friendly necromancers and your own reanimation spells fail inside the circle. This creates party management decisions about whether to place protective circles if you're running necromancy builds with undead minions who need space to reanimate. Some players deliberately avoid Circle of Protection specifically because it interferes with their reanimation. Tactics. Grand healing damages undead. The area healing spell. Grand healing paradoxically damages undead standing in its healing burst, dealing damage proportional to the amount it would have healed living targets. This makes grand healing an offensive tool against undead rather than pure support, allowing healer-build characters to damage enemies while supporting allies simultaneously. The damage is substantial against Draugr and vampires, often one-shotting lesser undead while fully healing any injured allies. This hidden offensive capability makes healing magic surprisingly combat viable when facing appropriate enemy types. The interaction is thematically appropriate, representing life energy burning undead flesh, but is never explained in-game. Restoration specialists who discover this often switch to grand healing as their primary offensive tool in crypts, casting it not to heal but to damage, incidentally healing party members as beneficial side effect. Healing hands on enemies creates hostility. Attempting to cast healing hands on hostile enemies successfully heals them, but generates permanent hostility flags that prevent calming or pacifying them afterward. The healed enemy becomes locked into aggressive state immune to illusion magic de-escalation. This creates bizarre situations where accidentally healing enemies through poor aim permanently enrages them beyond any normal calming ability. The mechanic exists to prevent exploits where players heal enemies to farm combat experience indefinitely, but it creates frustrating scenarios where aim mistakes have permanent consequences. Essential NPCs healed during their hostile phases can become permanently aggressive, breaking quests that expect them to return to normal. The hostility lock persists through area transitions and saving, requiring console commands or reverting to earlier saves to fix. Necromantic Healing has hidden cooldown. The perk that allows healing spells to affect undead minions actually has a hidden 3-second cooldown per individual undead target, preventing rapid-fire healing from keeping undead minions alive indefinitely. The cooldown is per target, so you can alternate healing different undead rapidly, but each specific undead can only receive healing once every 3 seconds. This prevents trivializing combat by sitting back and rapidly healing your undead army. The cooldown isn't mentioned in perk description, leading necromancer builds to assume their healing is bugged when it stops working on specific targets. Understanding the cooldown helps manage undead armies better, ensuring healing is distributed across multiple minions rather than wasted on one. The restriction encourages using diverse undead rather than relying on single powerful thrall, since multiple targets can be healed in rotation while single targets hit cooldown walls. Turn Greater Undead prevents. Soul Trap. Undead affected by Turn Greater. Undead cannot have their souls trapped even if they weren't originally flee-worthy targets. The turning effect somehow interferes with soul capture magic, similar to how Ash Shell blocks souls. This creates frustrating anti-synergies for players running turning builds who also want to farm souls, forcing them to choose between crowd control and soul harvesting. The effect persists even after turning wears off, as if the soul was displaced during turning and never fully returns to the body. Enemies killed while previously turned drop unsolvable corpses that persist indefinitely. The mechanic is likely unintended consequence of how turning temporarily removes the enemy from certain game systems, breaking Soul Trap's ability to acquire them. Players who prioritize soul gems learn to avoid using turn effects entirely, reserving them only for emergencies when souls don't matter. Sunfire burns vampires harder. Sunfire spells deal quadruple stated damage to vampires specifically, not just double like other fire effects against them. This makes Sun spells overwhelmingly powerful against vampire enemies, often killing them in single casts, when other fire spells require multiple. The bonus is separate from the undead-specific modifiers, stacking to create devastating anti-vampire offense. Vampire PCs taking sun damage also experience this quadrupling, making Sunfire the most dangerous spell in existence for vampire player characters. The interaction creates specialized tool specifically for Dawnguard questline, where vampires are primary antagonists. Players running Dawnguard as pure destruction mages often struggle until they discover Sunfire's hidden vampire multiplier, after which vampire encounters become trivial. The bonus doesn't apply to werewolves despite them being categorized similarly, appearing specifically coded to counter vampirism. Poison Rune is restoration. Despite being classified as destruction magic in most contexts, the Poison Rune spell actually scales with restoration perks and is considered restoration school for skill leveling purposes. This creates bizarre situations where destruction-focused mages find Poison Rune surprisingly weak, while restoration builds find it unexpectedly powerful. The miscategorization likely stems from poison damage being more thematically appropriate for restoration's disease and affliction subschool. Poison Rune benefits from Necromage perk if cast against undead, despite poison normally being ineffective against them, creating unintended synergy. The rune also gains bonuses from regeneration boosting effects, treating poison damage as negative healing that scales with healing output. This makes Poison Rune particularly strong on hybrid healer damage builds. where it leverages healing bonuses offensively. Bane of the Undead creates light. In addition to harming undead, Bane of the Undead creates bright illumination that persists for the spell's duration and reveals invisible undead within range. The light component makes it valuable as dual-purpose spell, providing both damage and visibility in dark crypts. The illumination is brighter than candlelight and projects from affected undead, rather than the caster, lighting areas dynamically as affected enemies move. This makes Bane useful purely for lighting in dungeons, even when undead aren't present, though it's magicka intensive for that purpose. The revealing property exposes invisible ghosts and spirits, preventing ambushes from incorporeal undead. The light is wholly aspected, with different color temperature than regular light, appearing whiter and cleaner in dark environments. Some players use Bane aesthetically, liking the pure white light it creates compared to yellow torchlight. Fast healing scales. With missing health, fast healing's magnitude isn't fixed as stated. It actually increases proportionally to how much health you're missing when cast. At full health, it heals the stated amount. At 50% health, it heals 50% more. At near death, it heals double stated value. This scaling makes fast healing increasingly efficient as emergency heal, providing best value exactly when needed most. The scaling is subtle enough that most players don't notice, attributing varying healing amounts to imagination or misremembering. The mechanic rewards risky gameplay where you delay healing until critical moments, maximizing heal value rather than topping off constantly. It also makes fast healing more efficient than higher tier healing spells in low health scenarios, sometimes providing better magicka to health ratios when cast at dangerous thresholds. Fortified Destruction affects all magic schools. The Fortified Destruction enchantment's description is misleading. It actually reduces magicka costs for spells from all schools, not just destruction. The effect is weaker on non-destruction spells, providing half the stated percentage, but it universally reduces casting costs. This makes Fortified Destruction the most valuable enchantment for pure mages who use diverse schools, providing cheap universal cost reduction from single enchantment type. Stacking Fortified Destruction on multiple gear pieces creates mage characters who cast nearly free spells from all schools. The enchantment is more efficient than school-specific fortify effects, which only affect one school at full power. Players discover this accidentally when noticing their restoration spells cost less magicka after equipping Fortified Destruction gear. The game never explains this universal applicability, likely because it would make Fortified Destruction obviously superior to other enchantments. Fortify magicka regeneration caps lower than indicated. The interface suggests Fortify magicka regeneration can stack infinitely, but it actually caps at 500% bonus regeneration regardless of how many items you stack. This creates diminishing returns where adding more regeneration gear beyond certain thresholds provides zero benefit. The cap affects enchantments, potions, and perks collectively, making excessive regeneration investment wasteful. Players who stack multiple regeneration items, thinking they're creating exponential regeneration, discover they hit practical ceiling much sooner than expected. The cap exists to prevent regeneration from trivializing magicka management entirely, maintaining resource scarcity even on optimized builds. Understanding the cap helps players avoid over-investing in regeneration, redirecting resources toward cost reduction, which has no caps and provides better scaling. Soul gem size affects enchantment. Duration. When enchanting items with spell effects that have durations, the soul gem size used affects how long those durations last when the enchantment activates. An enchantment providing water breathing created with Grand Soul lasts twice as long as identical enchantment created with Petty Soul. This makes Grand Souls valuable beyond just providing more charges, actually improving enchantment quality. The duration scaling applies to all timer-based enchantments, including resistances, summons, and temporary buffs. Players min-maxing enchantment builds should always use Grand Souls for enchantments with durations, reserving lesser souls for simple, constant effect enchantments. The scaling isn't documented anywhere, making it discovery reserved for players who carefully compare enchantments created with different souls. Chaos damage bypasses elemental resistances. The chaos damage enchantment randomly deals fire, frost, or shock damage, but the randomness actually allows it to bypass elemental resistances in specific situations. If an enemy has high fire resistance but low frost resistance, chaos damage treats each proc independently, so frost procs ignore the fire resistance entirely. This makes chaos more reliable than single element enchantments against varied enemy types, providing insurance against hard counters. Enemies resistant to all three elements still take reduced damage, but chaos prevents situations where your enchantment becomes completely useless. The bypass also affects weakness effects. Each element proc checks for separate weakness debuffs, allowing one chaos hit to trigger 3 different vulnerability states simultaneously. Absorb. Health enchantments. Lifesteal from environment. Absorb health on weapons doesn't just drain health from enemies, it actually draws health from environmental sources, including plants, furniture, and even architectural features when struck. This creates bizarre situations where attacking objects heals you, allowing health recovery without combat. The absorption from environment is minimal compared to enemies, but provides small sustain during exploration. Some players deliberately strike environmental objects with absorb enchanted weapons to top off health between fights. The effect even works on dead bodies. Striking corpses with absorb weapons drains residual life energy, providing small healing from each corpse. This creates macabre but practical corpse draining strategies where you recover health by attacking bodies of defeated enemies. Fiery Soul Trap has hidden XP. Bonus: the Fiery Soul Trap enchantment provides fire damage plus Soul Trap, but it also grants 50% bonus enchanting XP when you use filled soul gems to enchant items. This hidden bonus makes Fiery Soul Trap weapons the optimal tool for leveling enchanting skill, turning filled soul gems into more valuable experience sources. Players grinding enchanting should always use Fiery Soul Trap weapons to fill gems, doubling their effective experience rate. The bonus applies retroactively, meaning gems filled before acquiring the enchantment still provide bonus XP if you had Fiery Soul Trap equipped when filling. The mechanic is completely hidden with no tooltip or documentation, discovered only through extensive player testing and data mining. Fortify carry weight effects. Equipped items. When you equip items with Fortify carry weight enchantments, they retroactively become weightless for carry weight calculations. A heavy armor chest piece weighing 40 pounds with Fortify carry weight enchantment effectively weighs 0 once equipped. This allows stacking carry weight gear without the gear itself contributing to encumbrance, creating self-sustaining carry builds. Players can wear full heavy armor plus multiple carry weight accessories while functionally unencumbered. The effect doesn't appear in inventory weight totals, only in actual movement encumbrance calculations, creating confusion where listed weight and movement penalties don't match. The mechanic makes carry weight builds far more powerful than expected, allowing excessive gear loadouts without penalties. Resist magic doesn't stack with elemental resist. Resist magic enchantments and elemental resistance enchantments use same resistance pool, meaning they compete rather than stack. Equipping both resist magic and resist fire results in only the higher value applying, not some of both. This makes specialized resistance builds more efficient than generalized resistance, since stacking single element provides full value while mixing resistance types wastes slots. Players should either commit fully to resist magic for universal coverage, or specialize in specific elements likely to be encountered. The non-stacking creates trap choices where seemingly smart resistance diversification actually provides less protection than focusing. Understanding the shared pool prevents wasted enchantment slots on redundant effects. Fortify skill enchantments. Affect spell power. Fortify. Magic School. Enchantments don't just reduce costs, they actually increase spell magnitudes by 1% per 5 points of skill boost provided. This creates power scaling where enchantments make spells more effective beyond magicka savings. The magnitude boost applies to damage, healing, and duration depending on spell type. Fortify Destruction significantly increases spell damage, while Fortify Restoration improves healing output. The scaling makes skill fortifying enchantments far more valuable than cost reduction, providing both efficiency and power simultaneously. Players focus purely on cost reduction, miss significant damage potential from skill enchantments. The mechanic encourages hybrid enchanting strategies combining cost reduction with skill boosting for optimal performance. Paralysis enchantments. Stack duration. Multiple enchanted items providing paralysis combine their durations when triggering simultaneously, creating paralysis effects lasting far longer than individual enchantments suggest. 2 1-second paralysis enchantments, triggering together create 3 seconds paralysis rather than 2, due to additive stacking plus bonus overlap. This allows creating paralysis builds with enough enchanted gear to trigger near-permanent paralysis on hit. The stacking works across all paralysis sources, including enchantments, poisons, and spells, compounding into devastating crowd control. High attack speed weapons with paralysis enchantments become chainlock machines, keeping enemies permanently frozen through rapid stacking procs. The mechanic isn't mentioned anywhere, discovered through experimentation by players noticing unexpectedly long paralysis from gear combinations. Enchantment, strength scales. With item value. The power of enchantments applied to items scales slightly with the base value of the item being enchanted, with expensive items producing stronger enchantments from identical soul gems. This creates optimization where enchanting high-value jewelry and armor produces better results than enchanting cheap equipment. The scaling is modest, approximately 5% stronger at maximum, but it compounds across multiple enchanted items. Players min-maxing enchanting should always use most valuable available items as enchantment bases. The mechanic creates gold sink, where purchasing expensive enchantment bases improves end results, rewarding investment in quality materials. The scaling isn't documented, making its secret known primarily to experienced crafters and theory crafters. Disenchanting unique items. Teaches hidden effects. Certain unique items contain enchantment effects not normally available through regular enchanting. Disenchanting these items teaches special enchantment variants with different magnitudes or secondary effects. Some unique items have hybrid enchantments combining multiple effects that normally require separate enchantment slots. Destroying these uniques to learn their enchantments provides access to otherwise unobtainable effects. The game never indicates which uniques have special enchantments, making it a risk versus reward decision to destroy potentially useful items for enchanting knowledge. Some players maintain lists of which uniques are safe to disenchant for valuable unique enchantments, versus which should be preserved for their direct utility.